This is my cousin Bear. I'm watching him right now. Are you gonna talk into the mic? I'm watching him for my aunt and uncle and cousins while they're out of town. So he's my cousin. His name's Bear, and he might be in my lap. He might be a little bit in and out of the screen today. So I want to talk about this topic because people have been a little curmudgeonly about it online with me. So to start with, we're talking about analog and digital audio today. And so I wanted to talk about really quickly about acoustic audio versus analog audio versus digital audio. So just for a basic rundown here, we have acoustic audio, which is those compressions and rarefactions in the air. That's the actual sound that we hear, that we perceive as human beings with our ears, right? And then we have analog audio, which is going to be variations in voltage. So whenever we have analog audio, we have audio that has been converted into that format in some way. So often we do that with a microphone, which is a form of transducer that you can use to convert those compressions and rarefactions into variations in voltage. We have things like our electric guitars and stuff where we use pickups. There's different methods that we use to create or work with or convert audio into the variations in voltage format. And then we have digital audio, right? Which is when we often take analog audio and we convert the variations in voltage into ones and zeros. And so then that's when sample rate and bit depth comes into play. That's when we start working with audio within our computers. And often there is analog audio somewhere along the signal chain when we're working with digital audio, right? So for example, when we have our interface converting audio to go out to our studio monitors, that's often converted into analog audio. It's carried down the cable in the form of variations in voltage, and then our speakers convert that into acoustic audio, so the compressions and rarefactions in the air. I have a whole video about this. I'm not sure if I want to link to it because it's like one of my first videos ever and I'm cringing just thinking about it, let alone watching it. But if I get the guts, I will put a link to that in the description or a card on the screen so you can check that out. But that's the basic idea, right? We have acoustic, analog, and digital. Those are kind of the big three. So when we're talking about analog and digital, there are pros and cons to using both, right? Digital tends to be much more affordable. It costs a lot to get something like tape to work with, right? Analog tends to sound very warm and be very pleasing to the ear. A lot of people really love the sound of analog, myself included. And using analog equipment is a really fun experience. I really love and enjoy the experience of working with analog equipment. And if you're having a good experience, there's an argument there that will affect the outcome, right? On the other side of that, we have digital stuff. There's a lot of software-based tools that you can use that will mimic analog audio. So if you love the sound of analog, there are a lot of options out there for you to try that are within the digital realm. And that means they're a little more accessible, right? So there are pros and cons, but I think ultimately what you should do is whatever you think serves your music best, whatever works best for you. And it's going to be different for every person. And I think that's great. That's part of the beauty of our art. But what I really want to talk about today is data capture, fidelity, and human preference when it comes to these methods of audio storage, so analog and digital. So like I already mentioned, when we talk about digital audio, there often is analog audio within our signal chain somewhere, right? So we have analog audio that's coming from microphones into preamps and then onwards. We often have analog equipment that we're tapping into that we're using at some point in the chain, right? There often is a combo of analog and digital going on when we talk about a digital setup. But often when we talk about analog versus digital, we're talking about the actual storage method itself. So if someone's like totally analog, if someone's studio is an entirely analog studio, then they're probably working in tape or something similar. And if someone is describing their studio as being a digital studio, then they're probably storing the audio in the computer in a digital format, right? And so I think it's important to point out, because I've seen this happen before where people assume because someone's studio is quote unquote analog or someone's studio is quote unquote digital, that is all they have. That they're purist about it, right? And when we're working in a digital setup, we have to convert analog to digital and back and forth. It's not like that. I'm sure a lot of people that work in studios or engineers will be very familiar with this. People that frequent studios are probably really familiar with this. And there's also the other side of that coin, right? If someone has an entirely analog studio, often they might have some old equipment that is actually digital. I have a video that I'll probably mention again in this video, but I have a video recently that I did about reverbs and reverb history. And a lot of those old reverbs that we know and love and use in studios all the time were the early digital reverbs, right? So just because someone has a quote unquote analog studio doesn't mean that it might mean that it's exclusively analog, but it doesn't mean that it's definitely 100%. 100% analog. So with analog audio, the storage medium itself contributes to the sound, adding noise and taming high frequencies, for example, so much so that back in, analog heyday, so to speak, a lot of the engineers had to spend a ton of time just trying to counteract the effect of the medium itself to make sound sound like it did in the actual room, which is where the term high fidelity comes into play. So I hate to be the one quoting the dictionary here, but I do think it's relevant to mention here that the dictionary defines high fidelity as the reproduction of an effect, such as a sound or an image that is very faithful to the original. So what I'm arguing here is that digital audio has the potential to easily be higher fidelity than analog. So the term high fidelity is actually a really interesting term to me because it had its heyday in the pre-digital era. So it's used less today because it's less relevant with digital. You don't have to struggle as much to make digital audio easily sound how it sounds in the room. You don't have to counteract the loss that inherently happens with mediums like tape. In a way, digital audio was so flipping efficient at doing high fidelity, at making things sound like they sounded in the room, that it basically caused the term high fidelity to go close to extinct overnight, at least in marketing materials. And actually, one of the books that we read a while back in my Patreon book club talks about this term high fidelity and how this happened and this whole history of it. It's really fascinating. I will find the information for the book and put it on the screen for you, and I'll put a link to it in the description as well. But it's fascinating if you want to read more about it. I think it's interesting that people that often still discuss high fidelity in terms of audio, they're often talking about older systems, right? So it's often older generations talking about analog equipment, sometimes like old stereo systems, stuff like that. And it's not so much younger engineers that are talking about like hybrid analog digital systems. So although analog audio is a continuous signal, it's a continuous variation in voltage, and it's not snapshots the way digital is when we take samples. I have videos about that too. I can put something in the description or on the screen here. Although it is continuous like that, and arguably whenever we convert energy into a different format, there's loss. Despite that, I would like to argue that digital audio actually has more information than analog audio because the medium itself, the storage medium itself, digital doesn't round off those high frequencies the way analog does. Analog doesn't reproduce the sound in the room as easily as digital will because you're adding more equipment that's going to round off that sound, that's going to affect the sound. But that does not negate the fact that many of us absolutely love the sound of analog and prefer it to the sound of digital, whatever that is, right? And there's actually a really interesting argument to be made here for the advent of high quality digital recording and how, because it opened up this world that made it so much easier to make things sound like they sounded in the room, it opened up the way for more abstract music creation, and it kind of caused this boom in abstract music creation, whereas previously things tended to be more on the realism side of the spectrum. And actually, Susan Rogers talks about that in her book, This Is What It Sounds Like. And I love that book. That is probably my favorite book that I recommend to people all the time. So I'll also put a link to that in the description. It's such a good book. It's all about music preference and taste and how that works and psychology and brain science behind it. And it's a really cool book. So I'll link to that in the description. But that's a topic for a completely different video. So I'm going to keep going, talking about analog and digital and try to get my thoughts out here. So the thing is that myself personally, I love the sound of analog. I love warm sounds. I don't like super bright things. I love Neve equipment, like out of the three big types of soundboards that in my mind, it's the big three I'm sure that's based on where I worked and what they had, but it's Neve, API, and SSL. Between those big three, Neve's my favorite, and that's the warmest and the most analog-y sounding, that's totally a word, compared to the other two, right? So I adore analog sound, but I also think that digital is technically higher fidelity. And I think that's okay to believe both of those things. So all that's to say that in my personal opinion, anyone who thinks that analog is higher fidelity than digital or quote unquote higher quality than digital is not is not correct. And again, that's just my personal opinion. That's my opinion from what I've read and what I've learned. But I do have a whole thought about that thing that I find interesting. So I don't personally think that there's a dissonance between the idea of digital is higher fidelity than analog, but I still prefer analog. I don't think there's a dissonance there. But it's occurred to me from talking to other audio nerds and other studio nerds that many people definitely do see a dissonance there. And they get upset about it, right? Some people see a dissonance there, and it's very, very interesting to me that a dissonance is perceived there. I've been online for a little while now, and I have had people get, I think, pretty upset, kind of upset at me when I've said these two things, that I think digital is higher fidelity, but I prefer analog. And I've had people say things to me like, oh, you must not actually prefer analog, you must not truly like analog, you're not a real analog fan, kind of gatekeeping the whole analog thing. They might say worse things, like, oh, you don't actually understand analog, or, you must not have had an opportunity to actually hear it properly. Aren't you so young? How could you have possibly had a good, a proper experience, which again is a form of gatekeeping, right? So I've had a lot of that type of thing said to me when I've said this opinion. And just to be clear, I was born in the 80s, so I might be older than I look, depending on how old you think I look. I have experienced analog equipment. I've experienced analog equipment growing up to some extent, and then I've also experienced analog equipment in studios. I've heard analog in some really great environments. One of my favorite episodes of Pro Studio Live, a show that I used to host, was when we had Steve Albini come in and they got the tape machine all fixed up in the studio that, our home studio that we were filming in. And he showed us a whole workflow in analog, right? Because that's all he worked in. And I loved that episode. And it wasn't just because it was Steve Albini. It was that feeling of being in the studio was so amazing. It was like, it's like that analog feeling is like, I call it the campfire effect, where it's just calming. It's very calming. It's much, it's different. It feels different. And I loved it. I really, really loved that experience. So I have had some good experiences with high quality analog setups. And despite the fact that I am primarily a child of the digital era, right? By the time I was an adult working in studios, most of them had converted to digital to some capacity or another. I was kind of like at the cusp of that switch, I think, is when I kind of started doing things. So all that's to say to people that think that, I've heard it, I like it, I'm on your side here, arguably, right? I just don't think that analog audio is higher fidelity than digital. And maybe that's just a semantic thing based on my definition of high fidelity, right? But a lot of people do seem to agree with me on the definition and still think I'm wrong here. So anyway, I was wondering, why the heck do some people seem to see dissonance here when there are obviously people like me who do not see the dissonance here? And it got me thinking, actually, about our culture, right? And I started thinking about how our culture has this obsession with the purely scientific or the purely logical being the inherently superior or the better thing, right? It's the idea that more is more, and if you can objectively measure that something has more detail, then it's obviously the better choice. It's the idea that something can just be logically better, right? But I think that's a fallacy. I think that it's tied to our idea in our culture that the only thing worth studying is STEM topics and that everything else is just indulgent or frivolous even. And that's great if you're a robot that doesn't have feelings. But more seriously, if you're not living in a society that's full of living, feeling human beings, right? Our science does not exist in a vacuum, and social and cultural study and endeavors can influence STEM topics and vice versa. So I think that we have to look at things in a more holistic way that acknowledges the interplay between the logical, observable, measurable, and the sensory, emotional, cultural, and sometimes messy human side of things. And so I guess that's a really long way for me to say that I sometimes think that it's a symptom of toxic ideologies in our culture, that people might see a dissonance between the fact that I think that digital audio is higher fidelity, but I also prefer analog. All right, so while I was preparing to do this video, I actually did a little bit of research into, the ideologies around STEM and around, science and technology, engineering and math, and how the importance of that in our culture is weighted very, very heavily. And I come from a family that does that. I'm from a very heavy science family, and I've been a part of that ideology for most of my life. And I think it's interesting to question it, and I think that there was a quote in an article that I wanna read to you, so I'll link the article below so you can read it. It's an article from the Washington Post, but the quote is this: So, "Innovation is not simply a technical matter, but rather one of understanding how people and societies work, what they need and want. America will not dominate the 21st century by making cheaper computer chips, but instead by constantly reimagining how computers and other technologies interact with human beings." I think that's so beautiful, right? Like, we love science, we love technology, we love all that stuff, but it doesn't, the relevance comes when it interacts with human beings. You can't just pretend that we just have this one little corner of it, It's like, I don't know. I don't know how to articulate it beyond that. And I think it's pretty beautiful. It's not something to deny, right? The fact that it's that interaction with human beings and our perception of things that influences such a big preference for analog for a lot of people in our culture, right? I'm not the only one that prefers a warmer sound, right? We have so many tools, so many millions of dollars that are put towards technology that mimics that analog audio, right? So there's actual analog equipment, right? But there's also this whole market of, for example, reverbs that mimic analog reverbs. I mentioned my reverb video earlier. We talked about some of those in my video. So, in that reverb video, we talked about how even with just one piece of classic analog equipment, like the EMT 140, for example, we have numerous plugins that are emulating that device, right? So we have like the UAD or the Altiverb plugins. We have other plugins that are emulating to some extent, but they don't advertise themselves as a direct emulation, So like Valhalla has plugins like that. We have tape emulation plugins. We have plugins that mimic soundboards and analog equipment. Sometimes they're part of a long chain of digital devices that are originally mimicking an analog piece of equipment. I think that is so cool, right? So we have things like PSP's 2445, which is a great plugin, and it's mimicking the EMT 244 and 245 digital reverb units. And a lot of times when you look into digital reverb units like that, the early digital reverb units, a lot of them were trying to mimic analog equipment originally. So you have this long chain of things, happening, and it's a lot of a lot of the modern digital stuff is stemming from a love for analog equipment. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that having more accurate data capture in the case of audio does not inherently lead to better music. It's a lot of fun, but it's not everything. Cool. So what do you think? I'm going out on a limb again here. So let me know what you think of this video in the comments below. As always, I have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/CatoNoise. Please feel free to check that out. Please interact with this video. It helps me out. Click the things in my description. That helps me out too. It helps me stay independent. I've been running a book club on my Discord server for my Patreon. We've been having a lot of fun with that. And even if you don't want to join that, I have a bookshop.org bookstore, I guess. It's like a little affiliate page where if you want to buy any books that are like music or audio related, I have a great list there. Please feel free to check that out. It's in the description. And if you buy anything on there, it will help support my channel. So please feel free to check that out. And as always, I come out with new videos every Wednesday, and thank you so much for hanging out. Okay. Don't lick them. These are not for licking. These are glasses. They're not for licking. They're for seeing. Do you want to try them on? Ooh, yes, very distinguished gentleman. No, 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 no. Okay, we're good. I think we're good. Okay? Okay. It's like the idea of the more accurate data capture thing too, I think is interesting because there are other places where that presents itself, right? Like we talk about Q value with EQs, right? So with a Q value, if it's a higher value, it's a skinnier Q. And that comes from the electronics world. The Q stands for quality. And a lot of times with electronics, if something's more specific, so it's a thinner bandwidth, then it has a higher quality, right? But with audio, our Q value on our EQ doesn't mean that it's a higher quality, right? So if it's a higher Q value, it's not inherently a higher quality. Oftentimes we don't want that. We actively do not want that. So I don't know. I see this in a lot of other areas as well. And I think that's really, really interesting. And I don't know if this is too abstract a concept or too nerdy a concept, if people are into it or not, but I think it's really interesting. So here I am, as usual, just doing whatever I think is interesting, whether or not that hurts my channel. So that's fun. I'm making great decisions over here. Honestly, let me know what you think. I do try to adjust based on what people are into. Hope you're all doing well. Bye.